Welcome back, my friends, to the knife build series where we're going to be building a bushcraft knife. In the previous video, we got our knife completely ready for heat treatment, and in today's video, we're going to be doing just that. We're going to be heat treating our knife. This is my favorite part of the entire knife making process. I don't exactly know why. It's probably because it's the easiest and the part where I get to sit on my butt the most. But in any case, this is the step where we take what is essentially a bar of steel and turn it into something useful. This is where we give the knife its soul. This is also the most important part of the knife making process because you can make the ugliest knife in the entire world, put a good heat treatment on it, and it's still going to make an excellent cutting tool. You can make the most beautiful knife in the entire world, put a terrible heat treatment on it, and it might as well be a pretty butter knife.
Stand back, I've got Damascus.
So before we get into it, we've got to get a couple of things out of the way real quick. We could make an entire video series just talking about heat treating. We're not going to do that in this video. I'm just going to be bringing you along for what I do. We're going to be mentioning a lot of details in this video, but not getting into every single detail in this video of why I'm doing what I'm doing. Again, we could go into an entire video series explaining this, and that's not really what this video is about. Now, I'm going to be using a temperature controlled heat treating kiln. I call it an oven because that's essentially what it is. It works exactly the same way as your kitchen oven at home with heating coils. It's just more insulated and gets a lot hotter. If you're using a forge, the same basic principles are going to apply. The thing is, though, is that because I have a temperature controlled oven, I'm going to be able to do certain things that those of you using a forge are not going to be able to do. We'll sort of touch on those as we go along here. The other thing is that heat treating is one of those things that is, even though it's an exact science, meaning we know exactly what's happening inside the steel at any given temperature, is something that there's a lot of opinions on. This is just my heat treating recipe. There's a lot of different heat treating recipes out there that may differ from mine. I've come to this heat treating recipe based on lots and lots of testing and breaking an awful lot of knives. I have a couple videos on sort of what went on behind the scenes in terms of me doing testing and stuff. Man, difficult to break. But I'm constantly testing blades, and I'm constantly testing new batches of steel that I get. Out of every new batch of steel that I get, I do a test piece or a 3 just to make sure that the steel that was supposed to come to me is actually the steel that came to me. Mislabeling steel happens all the time. So with that being said, let's go ahead and we'll get started on the video, and we'll touch more on a lot of the intricacies in heat treating as we go along. So something else I need to mention here real quick is that this heat treating process, it only applies to 1084. It's very steel specific. It's not going to apply to any other type of steel. If you're using a different type of steel, you absolutely positively need to do some research as to the best combination of temperatures and times at temperatures and things like that to make sure that you're getting the best heat treatment possible, as well as doing your own experimentation. If you're a beginner, I don't want to tell you this to intimidate you, because you can certainly get a good heat treatment on a piece of 1084 using a very simple heat treating process. And I will try to put a link at the end of this video to some of my first knives that I ever made, which is kind of embarrassing. But you can go back and look at how simple my heat treat setup was and just what those knives are capable of doing using a really simple heat treating process. So just because I'm doing certain things in this video that you might not have access to, that doesn't mean that you can't get a good heat treatment process on a simple high carbon steel like 1084. So the first thing that we're going to do here is go ahead and do a foil packet for this during the thermal cycles. Now what that's going to do is protect this knife from the oxygen in the atmosphere. A simplified version of this is that as the knife is exposed to very high temperatures, or as high carbon steel is exposed to very high temperatures, some of that carbon will actually cook out of the steel and deposit itself on the surface in the form of scale. Now later on we're going to have to remove the scale to make the knife shiny again, and the less decarb that happens on the surface, it just means that it's less decarb that we have to remove later on. So this foil packet will help prevent as much decarb as possible during the thermocycling process. Now if you're doing this in a forge, you cannot do this process. This is only if you have an oven, but don't sweat it. This is not an absolute necessity. This just helps sort of the finishing process later on and helps speed things up, in my opinion. So making this foil packet is relatively simple. We're going to start with some stainless steel foil, which is not aluminum foil, by the way, and it's not flashing that you get from Home Depot. Those two things will melt inside of your oven or forge. You can get the stainless steel foil at just about any of your major knife making supply dealers. It's relatively easy to find. This stuff is rated to 2200 degrees. It's sort of expensive, so use it sparingly. First thing I'm going to do is cut off a 6-inch piece. Then we're going to fold it in half and then double fold both of the ends in order to make a packet. It's important to make double folds so that the packet itself is airtight. And then I use a hammer to tap down and further crease the folds in order to make 100% sure it is as airtight as possible. Next, I coat the entire blade in baby powder, and I add a little bit of baby powder, keyword here, a little bit, inside the foil packet to coat the inside of the packet. The baby powder will help keep the blade and the foil from welding itself together at higher temperatures. At the 1600 degrees we're going to be thermocycling at today. That's not a huge issue. If you are using air hardening steels or going a little bit higher temperatures than what we're using here today, this foil packet welding itself to the steel is a real possibility, and if that happens, it's a real pain to get off. Okay, so this is the thermocycling recipe we're going to be following. I was going to show every single thermocycle, but to tell you the truth, it's exactly the same thing, just at different temperatures. The first cycle, we're going to be heating it to 1600 degrees, put the knife in, bring the knife up to 1600 degrees, and then pull it out and let it cool in still air. The second cycle, we're going to bring it up to 1550 degrees and then let it cool in still air. The third cycle, same as the first two, except at 1450 degrees, and the fourth cycle, same as the first three, just at 1200 degrees. So I'll go ahead and show you one of these cycles. This is the 1600 degree, the first cycle. Bring the knife out in the foil packet and we'll place it in the vise. Being careful not to touch the blade portion of the knife with the pliers or the clamp. That way we get a nice even cooling distribution. Let's go over what we're doing here with thermocycling. Essentially, the best way that I can explain it, and this is a really simplified version of this, is imagine we have a bar of steel like we have here. Now imagine this bar of steel is made up of individual grains of compressed sand. Now the idea behind thermocycling is that during the course of working the steel, whether it's forging or drilling holes in it or just manipulating the steel in general, doing our profiling, will cause those grains within the steel to sort of bunch together and form larger grains within the steel matrix. Now the idea behind thermocycling is that by doing these thermal cycles, we actually redistribute those grains and we make them physically smaller. This will do a couple of things for us. Not only will it give us a much stronger knife that we're able to leave a lot harder, which is good for knives, with the same strength, because the smaller and tighter the grain structure, the stronger the steel itself. It'll also give us things like better edge retention. It'll make the knife easier to sharpen, and it'll allow the knife to get physically sharper. And that's what really gives us a good heat treatment, in my opinion, is doing this thermal cycling. Very simplified explanation of what's actually going on here. You can certainly do more research on it, and we could go into an entire video series just talking about this, so keep that in mind. And this is our last one at 1200 degrees. Okay, so while that's cooling down, I'm going to go ahead and get our oil ready. I'm going to be using Parks AAA as our quench oil. I'm going to preheat it to around 100 to 120 degrees or so. And I preheat it simply because it gives me consistency. Right now it's 40 degrees in the shop. if I'm in here during the summertime, my quench oil is going to be much warmer than 40 degrees. So I just go ahead and preheat it to 100 to 120. That way, every time I quench, the oil is at exactly the same temperature, and I feel like that adds a little bit of consistency to my results. Whether it does or not, I don't know. It is a formulated quench oil, so it can handle slight temperature differentials and things like that. And just sort of puts my mind at ease knowing that the oil's at the exact same temperature every single time. So one thing that I always do if I'm using a heater like this, whether it's gas or electric, is I always set a timer for a couple of minutes so that I don't forget that this thing is running and overheat my oil to like 400 degrees. In that case, you have to wait till the oil cools back down, and it just is a big waste of time, and it's just not necessary. I've forgotten that I had this going before, and I've heated my oil up way too much, and it just screws things up. So I'm gonna set a timer right now so I don't forget that it's on. Okay, so our oil is ready to go. Our blade is almost cool enough that we can handle it and unwrap it and get it back into the oven. What I'm doing now with these two pieces of angle iron is I'm getting them set up in the vise, and these are going to be our blade straightening devices. Basically, we're going to bring the blade up to austenizer temperature, 1475. We're going to quench it, and then we are going to pull it out of the quenching oil. And while the blade is still hot, between the temperature ranges of about 400 degrees and 200 degrees, we're going to get it over here and clamp it real tightly between these two pieces of angle iron. These are actually, these have been somewhat flattened and straightened, so they're perfectly straight. And this is going to force our blade to continue cooling and to continue to form that martensite in a completely straight position. So hopefully this will take care of most of our warps. So far this has done a really good job for me in mitigating warps. We still might have a very slight one depending on a couple of things, but we'll see. Okay, so our austenizing cycle looks like this. Ramp as quickly as possible to 1475 degrees. No soak time as soon as it hits 1475. Quench it in Parks AAA. Quench it, use the slicing motion. I wouldn't use a stirring motion. And what I find is that usually once the blade stops smoking, we can go ahead and, at least on the blade portion, we can go ahead and get it into our clamp. Bring it over here. There we go. Alright, let's show you what we got. We've clamped this thing straight. The blade portion's actually is already cool. That this clamp actually sucks out the rest of that heat really fast. So we should end up with a relatively straight blade at this point. Fingers crossed, nothing weird happens and we don't have to start over, but I think we're looking good so far. Go ahead and take this out. And so, I'm not sure if you can see just how little decarb we had on the blade here itself. If we did not foil wrap it, we'd have a lot more decarb along the blade than what we have here. So this will definitely help with finishing the knife later on. And it's skating a file very nicely. There's no way that this file is biting into the steel on this knife. So we got a nice hard blade. We're going to go ahead and check it along the entire length. Yep, we're good all the way around. Okay, so hopefully you can hear me. I have the camera set up way over there. I'm going to talk loud so you can hear me, but whatever. We've got a nice, relatively straight blade. No crazy major warps whatsoever, and this leaves us with a really good starting point for doing our flattening. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our same pieces of angle iron, and we're going to put the blade between them like this, and we're going to do a clamped temper. That way we remain straight during our tempering process. And our clamp temper just involves taking a couple of clamps, clamping this thing straight. Wipe the oil off of here. Oil gets everywhere. A tight squeeze getting everything in here, but we've got our oven thermometer in there so we can closely monitor the temperature. We've got our knife in there and the clamp, and our oven's cooled down enough. We will watch this as we heat up, make sure we don't overshoot our temperature, and we'll start our temper cycles. And here's our temper cycles. Cycle 1 was at 415 degrees for 2 hours, and then we remove it and let it cool to the touch. The second cycle was 415 degrees for 2 hours, remove and let it cool to the touch. My oven holds the temperature fairly accurately once I dial in the display for what's actually happening inside the oven. If your oven varies between, say, 400 and 425, don't sweat it too much. It'll be close enough. All right, still a little warm. I think we can take this off. There's our fully tempered knife. And we are pretty flat and pretty straight. So there we go. Okay, so our heat treating process is completed. As you can probably see, it's not super efficient to heat treat a single knife. It's much more efficient to heat treat multiple knives at the same time because you have fixed periods of time, like the temper cycle. You cannot make that any faster. It's a 4-hour fixed period of time. You can temper multiple knives at the same time, and I usually do, but for the sake of this video, I'm only doing one. However, I did make good use of my time during the tempering process, and well, let me show you. I profiled another knife. So now in the next video, we're going to be focusing on getting this knife ready to grind our bevels. We're going to be making this completely straight and completely flat. So stay tuned for that. If you like this video, please hit the like button. It's free and it really helps out the channel. Also, if you're not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button. Again, it really helps me out. And we will see you in the next video. If you have any questions, ask me in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Again, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.